Hello, good to be with you. My name is Fred Fox, and I'm a retired librarian. My subject today is the Shakespeare Authorship Question. It is a question that is easy to explain but seems difficult to resolve. It concerns, on the one hand, this man, whom we all recognize as William Shakespeare, and it concerns, on the other hand, that well known body of work that appeared under his name. The whole question arose when evidence after his death began little by little to cast doubts on his authorship. And that happened like this. In 1621, all the last versions of the Shakespeare plays were brought together, edited, and over the next 2 years printed in one folio volume. About 1,000 copies were ready for the market in time for Christmas 1623. Readers were impressed by the extraordinary richness of language and thought on display here. And in one of the introductory verses, reference was made to a monument erected to the author at Stratford in the county of Warwickshire. From the start, people were motivated to make the pilgrimage to this man's hometown. But what the pilgrims found there flew in the face of their expectations. In Holy Trinity Church, visitors were shown the register that recorded William, son of John Shakespeare, as they pronounced it there, was baptized on 26 April 1564. And it was as Will Shakespeare Gent that he was buried 25 April 1616. On the wall next to his grave, visitors found the fine monument as reported in the first folio. But on the block of stone covering his remains, there was a verse that the man had reportedly written for himself. It reads, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to move the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." And in the wall behind it, in a monument to one of his friends, the moneylender John Combe, locals pointed out another verse by this man Shakespeare. "10 in the 100 here lieth engraved, 100 to 10 his soul is now saved. If any one ask who lieth in this tomb, oh ho, quoth the devil, 'tis my John a Combe." Yes, why was there no Shakespearean richness of expression here? But the locals were not yet done. They claimed to know one more verse that their man had composed. It dated back to before William Shakespeare went to London and told of his feelings towards a local lord by the name of Sir Thomas Lucy, on whose property Shakespeare had been caught poaching. "A Parliament member, a justice of peace, at home a poor scarecrow, at London an ass. If Lucy is Lucy, as some folks miscall it, then Lucy is Lucy, whatever befall it." It began to appear that this man William Shakespeare, on his own, composed poetry of a rather pungent, down-to-earth sort, both before he went to London and afterwards. That did not sit right and required explanation. The pilgrims asked around, but Shakespeare's wife and daughters, who had inherited everything from him, were discovered to be illiterate and claimed to have nothing in Master William's handwriting to show. It was all thank you and Goodbye. Whatever the visitors may have thought coming home, they were sure of one thing. The editors and printers of the first folio put the name Master William Shakespeare in the title of the book. And as if to reinforce that message, below it they placed an engraved image of him. The face resembles in many aspects a painting that today hangs in the National Portrait Gallery of London. A comparison of the John Taylor portrait with the engraving done by Martin Droeshout indicates that the engraving is very much a tracing of the other, probably done with the camera obscura. The right eye, nose line, and nostrils line up exactly, as do the philtrum and lips. And although the left eye has shifted slightly, we can move it back momentarily and compare. It fits like a glove. And then all those interfacial contours are very much a point-for-point match. But now, before proceeding, the engraver was given some special instructions. The painter had made the mistake of showing the entire right eye, momentarily forgetting his perspective. Could that be corrected? Second, the ear sat too high to be anatomically accurate. Could that be corrected? And that earring removed? And then, could the hairline be receded, the hair thinned and cut, and the chin given a shave? Meanwhile, in another part of London, work was underway preparing the Stratford Monument. In the image sculptor Gerard Johnson chiseled out, we see all the same things going on as in the Droeshout engraving. There is the same corrected face, the same receded hairline, the haircut, the removal of the earring, and the shave. And here we find the goatee and upturned mustache the memorial makers appear to have wanted. Now, goatees and upturned mustaches in this style were unknown in 1623 London. The originator of the style, Flemish painter Anthony van Dyck, had only this year sent this portrait of himself to the English court. The new style caused a sensation among those with access to court. But it appears that Master Droeshout, the engraver, had no such access, and was relying on a verbal description of how such a new style goatee and upturned mustache should look. And unfortunately, he would get it entirely wrong. This would explain all the extra work he now had to do to hide the misunderstanding. It somewhat marred his work. But now, before we can leave the engraving, there remains the further issue of the body. The overall effect, as Northrop Frye pointed out years ago, was to make Shakespeare look like an idiot. Now, the doublet or sleeveless jacket with its straight row of buttons, though two-dimensional, is drawn according to a fairly common practice of the time. But it is too small for the head, which now takes on a grotesque bulbous look. We make better sense of it only when we imagine the body puffing up to take on its rightful size. Now, we know Martin Droeshout certainly knew where the real shoulder line lay. He would have had that in his original tracing. And other work of his from this time indicates he certainly understood human proportions. No, I must contend this funny business, especially the inclusion of this neckline below the chin line, is all nothing an engraver of this time would have taken upon himself to do. No, this can all have been done only to order. Opposite the image, we find a taunting little poem by one of those involved, playwright and poet Ben Jonson. It begins, "This figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life." Perhaps we have some better appreciation now for Jonson's layers of humour. But why would the memorial makers want to present the very person they have come to honour in such an odd way, and then even have a laugh at it? It didn't make sense. When we turn the page, we come first off to a letter written by two of the actors who had performed in these plays for many years, John Hemming and Henry Condell. The letter is addressed to two lords, William Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, and his brother Philip, the Earl of Montgomery. From the letter we learn that their lordships had been followers and supporters of the works, as well as the author living for a long time. The letter asks their lordships to now use the like indulgence towards the works as they had of the parent who made them. The actors go on to describe the man from Stratford as a worthy friend and actor, and indicate they are publishing the works in his memory. Continuing on, we next come to another letter signed by the same two actors. This one is addressed to the general reader. It is mostly a call to buy the book and not to criticize it without first reading. But again, briefly, the man from Stratford appears, and here an explanation is offered for how he had been able to achieve all this literary brilliance. We are told he was a happy imitator of nature, that it all flowed from his mind to his hand so easily that his fellows had never so much as found a blot in his papers. Turning the page one more time, we next come to Ben Jonson's second appearance. His verse here is called "To the Memory of My Beloved, the Author." I paraphrase. Yes, Johnson opines the work is of the very finest quality, as all men know, but how can he praise the poet when words only get so twisted up? For Johnson to praise the poet Shakespeare would be as if, and here I quote, "some infamous bawd or whore should praise a matron. What could hurt her more?" Now, excuse me, but Johnson the whore? Shakespeare the matron? Here, at this memorial site? The pages of scorn and vitriol the Academy has heaped primarily upon Ben Jonson for how the memorial makers present the author would be enough to bury the man standing several times over. And yet the question remains, why would they do that? By turning to the plays, we discover what we actually like about this book. The first play, The Tempest, with its stormy opening scene of a ship trying desperately to save itself, is already high drama enough to draw us in. There are 36 scripts here, ready to be brought back to life, many of which have remained popular into our own day. From the beginning, as people read the plays, many were reminded at times of other books they had read. And indeed, very quickly it became clear that rather than being the work of some natural genius, these plays are all based on a large number of other books. Whole plots, subplots, situations, characters, names, and notions have been discovered to come from a large library of book and manuscript sources. Although it is one of Shakespeare's most original plays, look at what already lies at back of The Tempest. Or the next play, Two Gentlemen of Verona. It indicated right away that Shakespeare the poet, rather than being a natural, was in fact a deep reader of large numbers of books in English, but also in French, Italian, Spanish, and Latin. We have before us now a twofold mystery. On the one hand, there is the strange question, why did the man from Stratford himself not compose poetry in the style of Shakespeare? And second, why did the memorial makers, despite crediting him with the works, then play fast and loose with his memory? Despite these emerging questions, people continued to read and admire Shakespeare's works, and the search after the author continued as well. Over the course of the 17th century, quite a lot came to be known about the man from Stratford. When Nicholas Rowe published the complete works in 1709, he was able to include a short life. William, son of John Shakespeare, was born to a yeoman family, all set to rise to gentlemanly status. William was sent to school. Though we now know his father had the trade of glove maker, Rowe presents him only as having been a dealer in wool. It was a business we have learned since Rowe John Shakespeare had no right to be in, and the family appears to have met a grave financial crisis when the government cracked down on illegal wool trading in 1576. Rowe did understand that there had been a financial setback, and that young William, some 13 years old at the time, was withdrawn from school and brought up in his father's profession of commodity trading. At 18, he married, and he would be the father of 3 by the time he was 21. William Shakespeare continued this way for several years more. The townsfolk of Stratford reported that his move to London was entirely precipitated by the poaching incident with Sir Thomas Lucy. But the outcome, as the locals described it to visitors, was that he ran away and found his way to the London stage. Rowe was still under the impression that Shakespeare the poet was a natural wit, a man who did not need book study. To his eyes, then, it made the exile from Stratford to the London stage appear but a happy adventure. But then, in 1747, Joseph Green, the then vicar of Holy Trinity Church, found Shakespeare's original will. There, in one sentence stretching to 3 pages, Shakespeare, with considered care, itemizes and divides his entire estate. Despite disbursing some £800 in money, property, and goods, proving he died a gentleman of substance, the tone of the will itself is one of bare-knuckle practicality, There is no mention of tapestries, paintings, globes, maps, books, manuscripts, or anything else scholars with means tended to have. If nothing else, he should have left a library of his own 22 already printed books. But again, nothing. But the will does sit very comfortably with the wheeling-dealing country poet we have met. And in it was the man's own signature at the bottom of each page. He signed himself William Shakespeare. A gap between this man who did not write like Shakespeare or sign his name like Shakespeare and the literary works to bear that name was becoming evident to everyone. In 1769, Herbert Lawrence published The Life and Adventures of Common Sense, an historical allegory. In one story, Common Sense tells us Shakespeare, the deer stealer, further steals a literary diary which told him how to express all the different sentiments of the human mind. And he steals a magical glass capable of penetrating the deep recesses of the soul of man. And he steals a mask which, when worn, made every sentence extremely pleasant and entertaining. With these three instruments, the Stratford man becomes the poet we know. It was meant in jest, but the point had been made. Matters took a sharper turn in 1786 with the publication of the story of the learned pig. Here, a friendly pig who remembers many past lives recalls once being an Elizabethan playhouse horse-holder named Little Billy. It was the pig as Little Billy who actually dictated the lines, word for word, to Shakespeare for at least 5 of the plays. So the real author was, in part at least, a learned pig. It appears some people were starting to smell bacon. Over the course of the 19th century, it came to be believed that because Shakespeare's law was so very good, that a legal expert like Sir Francis Bacon must have been the hidden author behind the works. Whole lives and fortunes were spent in the search to prove it so. And when no proof could be found, the search then became one for supposed secret ciphers that Bacon had left embedded in Shakespeare's text. What madness! And what an irony! For if they had chosen to work by Sir Francis Bacon's scientific method, they would have known when to back up, and they would have been spared all their disappointment. And then, heeding no one's advice, the 20th century made everything worse by producing new authorship candidates by the dozen, all using the same flimsy methods. The solution to our small, though genuine mystery has become a great big muddy mess. Who wrote Shakespeare? Take your pick. But are there really no solid leads here? No solid evidential trails? Didn't anyone say anything? Well, tantalizingly, one man did say one thing. He uttered his words only once in an unguarded moment shortly after the publication of the first folio. He was then living in retirement at Warwick Castle, just 8 miles up the road from Stratford. He had been asked what he wished his life to be remembered for, and he answered with a list of 5, but began with the words that he wished to be remembered under no other notions than of Shakespeare's and Ben Jonson's master. His name was Fulke Greville, Baron Brooke. He is the man, then, that Jonson answered to. If history would heap abuse on anyone for how Shakespeare was laid to rest, I believe it should be this man. But before we heave anything, let's follow out the course of his life and discover where that mastership may have begun. Fulke Greville was born Baron Willoughby de Brooke, just downriver from Stratford, at Beauchamp 10 years before William Shakespeare's birth. And the Baron would die just upriver at Warwick Castle 10 years after him. As such, Greville's life chronologically, as well as socially and geographically, already encompasses the life of the man from Stratford. Greville's father was Sir Fulke Greville, the Sheriff of Warwickshire. Like Sir Thomas Lucy at Charlecote, the Grevilles were political allies of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and the Queen's paramour. In the year of Shakespeare's birth, Greville, now 10, was sent just north to Shrewsbury School. There he was joined by another 10-year-old, a family acquaintance who now became his very dearest lifelong friend, Philip Sidney. The two became inseparable. After performing some embassies to the continent for Queen Elizabeth in the late 1570s, the friends, now in their early 20s, began experimenting with English literature. They hoped to equal the best the classical world, or their own contemporaries in Italy and France especially, could hold up. Not much memorable English poetry had been written since old Father Chaucer, almost 2 centuries before. Although the two enjoyed early successes, it was Sidney who, during a prolonged stay at his sister Mary's house, suddenly initiated a great torrent of words in which he made commanding demonstration of what the English language could do. He was in the process of rewriting his Arcadia to a yet higher level when in 1585 he joined his uncle Robert Dudley's military expedition to fight the Spanish in the Netherlands. After taking a bullet in the knee at the Battle of Zutphen, the wound would gangrene and Philip died. Greville was devastated. He writes in part, "Knowledge her light hath lost, valour hath slain her knight. Sidney is dead, dead is my friend, dead is the world's delight." He was, woe worth that word, to each well-thinking mind, a spotless friend, a matchless man, whose virtue ever shined, declaring in his thoughts his life, and that he writ highest conceits, longest foresights, and deepest works of wit. Now sink of sorrow I, who tied to wretched life, who looks for no relief, must spend my ever-dying days in never-ending grief. In the wake of his friend's death, Fulke Greville would do what he could to shore up Sidney's reputation and legacy. But he would find competition for this in Philip Sidney's younger sister, Mary. It was to these two most ardent of supporters that Sidney's literary remains had passed. His sister Mary had his first version of Arcadia, which Philip had written for her, his sonnets, essays, and other occasional pieces. Fulke Greville had much the same, but he had specifically been entrusted with the rewritten but unfinished Arcadia. This version Greville set into print in 1590. But it hurt Mary Sidney to see her brother's work leave off mid-sentence. It brought the whole tragedy of his half-finished life into a too terrible relief. She had taken the news of Philip's death even harder than had Greville, falling into a severe depression. A very good London doctor named Thomas Moffat was lured to take up residence at her home of Wilton. He was also a naturalist and horticulturalist, an early maker of chemical medicines, and himself a piece of a poet. Little Miss Muffet sat on her, etc. As well, Sir Philip Sidney's page, Abraham Frowns, still a student of law here, now came under the Pembroke wing. Frowns was a precocious analyst, and during his first year at Wilton, he laid bare all aspects of writing poetry for the Countess. He simultaneously taught his other great specialty, legal logic. The healing process for the Countess became finishing those works Philip had left unfinished. Now, many men and women in Renaissance times learned to write poetry by turning the prose of David's 150 psalms as found in the Bible back into verse. But Philip had reached no further than number 43. So Mary took up where he had left off and versified the remaining 107 psalms, exhibiting mastery over an almost equal number of verse forms and rhyme schemes underway, just as Master Frowns had indicated. She also tried her hand at some translations, but her major undertaking became to bring her newly honed poetic skills to bear on the unfinished Arcadia. In the preface that would appear in 1593, Hugh Sanford, Mary Sidney's secretary, confides that all the work was done under the Countess's editorial direction, much of it by her personal doing. And though her motives were obviously to do the best for her brother, all this literary fervour was now to get her ladyship into some hot water in, of all places, a theatre down in London. The London of 1591 offered 3 playhouses, 2 up in Shoreditch and 1 south of the Thames. In May, there was a violent argument over money at the northernmost of them, the Theatre Playhouse. As a result, the house troupe, the Lord Admiral's men, walked out and installed themselves across the river at the Rose Playhouse. Not only was old James Burbage, the owner of the theatre, now without a troupe, he didn't even have a patron from whom he could get a license with which to build a new company. Burbage had always performed under the banner of Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. For over 20 years his company, the Earl of Leicester's men, were the most highly regarded in England. But Leicester had been forced to give that up in 1583, leaving Burbage to retire from the stage to run his playhouse. For several years, different troupes had performed at the theatre, but in the late 1580s, the Lord Admiral's men had moved in and enjoyed a long string of blockbuster hits. But with them now gone, James Burbage had first to find a new patron. That he should go to one of Leicester's descendants is almost to be expected. Family and clan were what held large groups of people together. But The clan of Leicester had taken a mighty beating in the decade just ended. Besides Robert Dudley himself, his nephew and heir apparent, Sir Philip Sidney, his brother-in-law, Sir Henry Sidney, who had been the Lord President of Wales, their close allies, Sir Francis Walsingham, who had been Her Majesty's Secretary of State, and his own brother, Ambrose Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, had all passed away. But there yet remained Leicester's niece, Sir Henry Sidney's daughter, Sir Philip Sidney's sister, the little girl with the big chin, who had grown up and married the much older but very, very rich Henry Herbert, Earl of Pembroke. Where or how the deal between Burbage and Pembroke was struck, we do not know. It could have been at any number of Pembroke residences. But we know from a letter written by one Thomas Nash that the Earl of Pembroke's men was ordained the new house troupe at the theatre by summer 1591. Over July and August of 1591, new material began to be prepared for the upcoming season by a solid team of writers with established credentials. The first Pembroke play concerned the beginning of the English Civil War of the previous century. Forensically, it appears that as two plotted out of the chronicle records, providing minimal dialogue as they went, two others came behind and padded in the scenes with finished dialogue. A fifth was brought in to write a couple of comic rebel scenes. This was Thomas Nash. But the progress appears not to have satisfied the Countess of Pembroke. One of her servants, school teacher and poet Nicholas Breton, would appear among the playwrights with messages from the Countess this summer and a copy of Sir Philip Sidney's dazzling sonnets. These sonnets were then still completely unknown to the playwrights. The Countess would have the playwrights know that she wished to engage with them in some editorial capacity in the work of producing new scripts for her troupe. Thomas Nash scoffed at this. Nash was a clergyman's son, long allied with the party of the bishops. He actually lived at this time in the Archbishop's palace as part of that man's household. He had put his acerbic wit at the service of the Church in a recent 18-month pamphlet war with the Puritans, who were agitating to remove the archbishops and bishops and bring in Calvinist organization to the Church of England. Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, had been responsible for much of this Puritan agitation, and the Archbishop had hated him more than any other man living. Aggravating Nash's cynicism further, we note that his writing elsewhere indicates he had great disdain for women generally, a bias he shared with many. With Leicester dead, some of that lingering anger could now be directed at his surviving daughter, that uppity woman Mary Sidney, and that bold proposal she had made to the playwrights to engage with them in their work could be held up for a little public ridicule. Thomas Nash took the whole batch of sonnets to one of the bishop's printers, John Danter, and arranged for their printing. He then gave or sold the copyright to bookseller Thomas Newman, under whose auspices the volume appeared. And he even provided a signed letter of introduction to the volume, wherein he explains his motive, as well as give a tell-all about what was wrong with playwriting at the theatre playhouse. He excuses the theft of the sonnets by stating that sonnets this good could not be permitted to lie imprisoned in ladies' casks and the president books of such as cannot see without another man's spectacles. He takes critical swipes at all his fellow playwrights, Christopher Marlowe and Thomas Kidd, Nicholas Breton not once but twice, Robert Greene, and especially George Peele, for whom Nash appears to have had a genuine loathing. Having already addressed the Countess as the eloquent secretary to the Muses, Nash descends into a critique of the group playwriting process, which he likens to learning lost in a grove of genealogies. And the cure was not to set an old goose over half a dozen pottle pots, which are, as it were, the eggs of invention, for the books that will result will be nothing but the wildfowl of good wits. All satire aside, we can be quite sure who the 6 pottle pots, the eggs of invention, are. And given the context, we can be quite sure who the old goose is. And this emblem of her ladyship incubating play scripts was, to say the least, extraordinary. Given how serious even a covert assault on a powerful noble was, we may be sure that Nash had the bishop's full protection here. But whatever chuckles were enjoyed at the Archbishop's palace were to be short-lived. Her Majesty was immediately prevailed upon, and the entire unsold lot was confiscated by royal order and burned. Some copies, of course, had already been sold. The situation was under control for the moment, but the vulnerabilities of her ladyship's too open approach had been brutally exposed, causing her to be held up for public ridicule. The players were bonded servants who could be trusted, but these playwrights were freemen of mercenary allegiance and temperamentally unpredictable. This would have been of some political concern to Mary Sidney's family and faction members. Of these we may number her husband, now the Lord President of the Welsh Council, Fulk Greville, the Council's clerk, even Abraham Franz, who had gone on to take the position of Crown Prosecutor. After committing his outrage, Thomas Nash also moved to the Rose Playhouse and began writing for the Lord Admiral's men. Moving backwards in the Chronicle records, he would write a popular play about the victorious years of King Henry's reign before the start of that awful civil war. And he wrote a pamphlet explaining why he could not go to the clan of Leicester for support. Back at the theatre, the remaining playwrights continued to provide new material for the Earl of Pembroke's men. Christopher Marlowe, on his own, wrote the most sweetly worded play of his career, Edward II, writing very much under the spell of Sir Philip Sidney's sonnets. Marlowe and his partner Thomas Kidd are the key candidates for the authorship of the as yet anonymous Italianate comedy, The Taming of a Shrew. And the entire team remaining produced a continuation to the first Civil War play. It was against this background that the Earl of Pembroke's men were to take in a new actor, William Shakespeare. We know it is somewhere here, for Nash does not mention him in September 1591, but Robert Greene will in August of 1592. According to the townsfolk of Stratford, until his move to London, Shakespeare had been under indictment for poaching. In Elizabethan England, poaching was a serious felony for which the common punishments were blinding, castration, or even the hangman's noose. Meanwhile, in London, there was a lady in a strange kind of distress. She had only wanted to exercise some inspiration and perhaps some direction over the play scripts being written for her troupe, but then had found herself satirically exposed out in public. Somehow, both sets of problems were to be resolved simultaneously to everyone's satisfaction. Now, who was in a position to bridge these two seemingly very different sets of problems? Who had the one-on-one relationship with absolutely everyone involved? It was Master. We know that Fulk Greville had been a close, long-time family friend of the Sidneys. Aside from his intense friendship with Sir Philip Sidney, it was Mary's father, Sir Henry Sidney, who had arranged Fulk's first important post, clerk to the Council of Wales. With Sir Henry's death, the post of Lord President had passed to Mary Sidney's husband, Henry Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke. In council or in family, Greville was close enough to the Pembrokes to make their concerns his concerns. On the other side, we find Sir Thomas Lucy, the man who wished to prosecute Shakespeare. Now, Sir Thomas Lucy was also a member of the Council of Wales. And on top of that, he and Fulk Greville were the two sitting members for Warwickshire in Parliament. They were fellow MPs. Now, add to all this the fact that the sheriff who had to arrest William Shakespeare and possibly hang him too was Fulk Greville's father, Sheriff Sir Fulk Greville. And then Shakespeare, I suppose realizing the terrible predicament he was in, made everything worse by slandering Sir Thomas Lucy with that verse of his. But maybe, just maybe, that poetic outburst was the man's salvation. However Shakespeare's tale of woe came to him, I believe that in its wake an idea, a somewhat terrible yet workable idea, took shape in Fulk Greville's mind. In Shakespeare, Greville had a strong, handsome, and vigorous man. As a 28-year-old father of three, he was mature. As a wheeler and dealer of some 15 years' experience, Shakespeare understood money and could be entrusted with different accounts. Shakespeare had gone to school sufficient years to be able to read and write. But that the man had a knack for composing witty, if coarse, little verses would have especially recommended him. And then there was the man's name. Although Master William's name locally was pronounced Shakespeare, there were here the makings for that much grander name, Shakespeare. For who was really known as the spear shaker? In their culture, this was the goddess Pallas Athena. She was the inspiration for all fine writing. And if Shakespeare needed any controlling, you would have to say that Master Greville had him rather over the barrel, as it were. Although he never said as much, I believe Fulk Greville's mastership of Shakespeare began here. We know that Shakespeare never went to trial, and we know he arrived in London and straightway became a full member of Pembroke's men. We may momentarily wonder who covered the £80 Shakespeare would have needed to buy a share in Pembroke's company at this time. But more than acting, from the beginning Shakespeare also began to assume responsibility for the Pembroke scripts, in particular for some rewriting that had taken place. And we learned this from a deathbed letter written by one of the other Pottle Pot poets, Robert Greene. In the spring of 1592, plague broke out in London. In the third week of May, the playhouses were all closed indefinitely. The companies of players escaped into the country for an early start to their season of summer touring. Of the 6 original writers, Robert Greene had been living this past year with a prostitute near the theatre playhouse in Shoreditch. Robert Greene, the first English writer to successfully live from his pen alone, had been earning at the top of his form this past year. Though he may have originally been lured to Shoreditch to help with the play scripts, Greene mostly used his mistress and her brother, a notorious criminal, as first-hand sources for a highly successful year-long expose of London's criminal underclass. At the beginning of August, he attended a celebration and there enjoyed much Rhenish wine and pickled herring. It was known that Greene was a heavy drinker, and he awoke the next day having suffered either liver or kidney failure. As he could no longer expel fluids, swelling began about his body. The costly medical help he hoped would save his life proved ineffective, and very soon he was destitute and living in the street. And there he might have died except that a cobbler's wife living in the Dowgate area took pity on him and installed him in her house. And although he was dying, he was not yet dead, and so his need for money continued. We know he got an advance from printer John Danter for the next installment of his criminal expose around the third week of August. And we know it was here somewhere that he had a meeting with the Earl of Pembroke's men. Now, this was extraordinary because the playhouses were all still closed and the companies of players on tour in the country. And although records indicate Pembroke's men had earlier in the summer been touring in Norfolk, north of London, we know they were back here in London because one of them, actor Simon Jewell, would die of the plague here in the third week of August. Jewell's will speaks of money that Mary Sidney, the Countess, has promised the players, of which Jewell's portion will be enough for all his funeral charges. The wording of his will betrays that the Countess had very much a cordial face-to-face relationship with her actors. Though the players were obviously not in town to perform, it appears they may have been rehearsing. The Countess had an upcoming date of the highest importance. The Queen, in her summer progress of 1592, was coming to visit Mary Sidney's North Wiltshire manor of Ramsbury. Her arrival was expected on the 25th of August. When the Queen came, everything, the accommodations, the food, and the entertainments, had to be of the very best, especially now given that the Countess's actors were here to be introduced to Her Majesty. In his meeting with the actors, it appears that Robert Greene asked for an advance of money. given that the plague was raging outside, and given how terrible he must have looked, we can appreciate the tensions inherent in that meeting. For reasons Green does not specify, the actors would deny him. Driven now by an intense sense of indignity, Green would complain loudly about the actors' cruel treatment of him. But buried in his words were a few nuggets of intelligence that he would report in a way only his fellow playwrights would understand. Green addresses the letter to the other playwrights, Marlowe, Nash, and Peele. Kidd and Breton are presumably the two more who have written for the company that Green mentions elsewhere. Green beseeches all five to never again write new material for Pembroke's men. They will betray you as they have betrayed me, he cries out over and over. Green informs the writers that the company had recently taken in a new actor, a man from the country, whom he dubs Shakespeare. He states quite openly that this upstart crow, as he calls him, has their work in hand, and imagines himself to be every bit the poet the rest of them are. And what makes this possible? Green states it is due to his tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide. To many ears it would have sounded, then as now, that the actor, master, shake, whatever, had a roaring personality and great actor's skill. But the playwrights whom Green addresses would potentially have read this very differently. For where others saw only Green's anger, they would have known the source of Green's illusion. For when Green alludes to Shakespeare as a tiger's heart wrapped in a player's hide, he is in fact drawing their attention to a line in a play that some of them had only recently written together. The play is Pembroke's second Civil War play, and we have the text as that was printed in 1595. In the play, the speech is directed at Queen Margaret and reads, "O tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide, how couldst thou drain the life-blood of the child to bid the father wipe his eyes withal, and yet be seen to bear a woman's face?" In other words, how had Shakespeare managed to rewrite the script? Behind the actor, there stood a woman. It appears the old goose had got herself a new face. We have now discovered how the mystery of Shakespeare's authorship developed. We glanced at some historical attempts at resolving the mystery, attempts that were hampered by faulty science. And we have met with the scenario that one man's testimony leads us into. But does it follow through? The answer is clearly yes, and that everywhere you now begin to look. For example, we need no longer wonder how Shakespeare got access to Thomas Moffat's manuscript for the story of Pyramus and Thisbe in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Those texts at the base of Mary Sidney's poetic education will in time come to be seen as among Shakespeare's base texts as well. We may note right away that Mary Sidney's use of the Geneva edition of the Bible reflects Shakespeare's own preference. We can now understand why Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadian style is the stylistic backbone for all Shakespeare will write, and that the political slant within the historical plays is, in the main, pro-Leicester, would now almost require no explanation. The name Shakespeare, though based on the Stratford man's real name, was a contrivance that the Stratford man himself never used. And we may add that he didn't write like Shakespeare because he was not Shakespeare. There was only one spear shaker, and that was Pallas Athena, the goddess patron of poetry, who was born by breaking out of her father Zeus's forehead, shaking a spear, the perfect emblem for a litterateur such as Mary Sidney. If in the engraving Master William's forehead looks particularly bulbous, it may well be that within there is another Pallas waiting to break out. As to the image, especially given that neckline, we can now see that his was more the shining outward face of an enterprise more complex than at first appears. Their lordships of the dedication being long-time followers of the parent who made the plays would now be a very good joke, for you see, Mary Sidney was their parent. She was their mother. When the actors describe Shakespeare as a good friend and fellow, they allude to the very real shareholder position he held in the company for some 22 years, and the cordial relations he maintained with the other shareholders throughout. That he was a happy imitator of nature begins now to hint at the female source for all the inspiration, for in this time men were considered to be art, women, nature. And here we may momentarily remember Johnson's opening verse and his claim that the engraver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. That the Stratford man never suffered a blot in his papers would now hint at the role he played of taking away what the other playhouse writers had written and returning, regardless of the rewrites, with clean final copy in hand. And as we come back to Ben Jonson's poem To My Beloved, we can now see that Jonson is indeed playing the old whore, as it were, to Shakespeare's matron. So, despite deceiving us, the memorial makers were not exactly liars either. They were just terribly, terribly subtle. Given the overwhelming resistance to women writing out of their own heads, expressing their own thoughts, this deception was perhaps the only way that the Countess of Pembroke could maintain her public reputation while still pushing ahead with her brother's literary agenda. Viewers interested in the evidence that underlies this entire presentation may consult my book, Tiger's Heart in Woman's Hide, available at libraries and online book retailers. In upcoming episodes, we will fully test our proposition against all that which is now to come. Thank you for watching. Until next time.